There were emotional scenes at an airport in Kiev as families, along with Ukraine's President Zelensky, welcomed around 76 newly released captives. They were part of a long-awaited 200-strong prisoner swap agreed between pro-Russian separatists and Ukraine's government. Earlier, the exchange at a checkpoint near the industrial town of Horlivka in the Donetsk region had taken nearly 5 hours to complete.
At the moment, I'm feeling good because I'm free. I'm a free person and finally I can walk freely and no one will stop me and no dog will bark at me and no one will tell me to stand up and put my arms behind my back.
I'm actually from Luhansk. I went to visit my parents, and when the conflict began, I was there. And the separatist military court ruled that I should serve 12 years for high treason. I have a child at home. I've been waiting for this day to come.
Ukraine's government's been criticised of giving away too much. Some of the 124 prisoners they released include 5 former members of the now disbanded Special Police Force, the Berkut, who had been charged with the killing of pro-democracy protesters in 2014.
I was tortured severely in Kiev before being taken to prison there, and the prison administration rejected me 5 times, saying, "Take him away. We can't take him. He's practically dead."
The swap is part of an agreement brokered this month at a summit of the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France. The conflict in eastern Ukraine has killed more than 14,000 people. Hopes for ending it have risen with the election of Ukraine's President Zelensky, who made it a campaign promise. But there are still issues over elections and more autonomy for the rebel regions to address. Evelyn Laverick, Euronews.
Well, to discuss more about what this prisoner swap means for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, I'm joined now by global affairs analyst Michael Bosakiw, former spokesperson of the Ukrainian mission for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much for your time. We heard there already in our report that there had been some criticism of Zelensky, that perhaps this hadn't been a fair trade. For which side do you think this played more into their hands?
Good morning, Rosie. Well, definitely played into the hands of Vladimir Putin. Like in the last prisoner swap, where at the last minute they demanded a so-called person of interest in the MH17 case that Dutch investigators wanted to interview. In this case, he also requested those 5 Berkut members to be handed over. I cannot overstate the significance of that handover of these 5 gentlemen. I can say that they're probably the most hated, despised men in Ukraine for what they did. And the other thing is, I think this was deliberately done by Putin to sow more disunity in Ukraine. Zelensky is going to come under a lot of criticism for that handover. And not only that, it does call into question the rule of law in Ukraine, because the constitution does ban the handover of Ukrainian nationals to a foreign government.
Zelensky really campaigned on a promise that he was going to restore peace in this area. Might the sacrifices to do so be too great?
It could be. I mean, right now, there are 3 disengagement zones where there's supposed to be peace, ceasefire. There is no ceasefire, according to the OSCE. And the leaders in Europe, which, you know, obviously they're trying to spin this as positive PR, but they want 3 more disengagement zones as well as a ceasefire in a couple of days' time, in other words, by the end of the year. So, but the prospects for peace are not very high at the moment, I must say.
Some of the more contentious things that Russia and Ukraine have got to agree on, if possible, is things like local elections in eastern Ukraine, who should control the border. Now we've had a little bit of movement with this prisoner swap. Do you think those bigger, more contentious issues, there might be space for traction now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the swap is a kind of confidence-building measure between the 2 sides. So there was also the gas contract that was signed. But the big thing the Ukrainians want is the disengagement, the ceasefire, and crucially, the return of the Russia-Ukraine border, which is now under rebel control. That has to happen before Zelensky can agree to those elections and perhaps giving some autonomy to those rebel regions. But a long way to go, I'm afraid, until we see that happen.
So what would it take for that to be the case?
Oh, at the end of the day, political will, as I've said for the longest time. The quickest way for this conflict to end, the biggest open wound in Europe, if you will, is for Vladimir Putin to pick up the phone, to call Donetsk and Luhansk and say, stop the fighting, come home, And with that type of political will from the Kremlin, that will end this very quickly and things can move forward. But I think Putin uses this conflict as a way to turn up the heat or turn down the heat on Ukraine as he requires.
Michael Bossack, thank you very much for your analysis. Appreciate your time this morning.